Hey, what's going on, everyone? This is kiodiekin. Hope you guys are all having a happy Cinco de Mayo here in the States. Wanted to mix everything up, do everything a little bit differently. I'm actually prepping for a fireworks shoot a little bit later. And it's really nice and sunny out here, nice and bright. Thought I would take advantage of the sun because I love to experiment and get in different surroundings. But in today's video, as you guys can see, we have the Raspberry Pi 5. And today is going to be kind of a follow-up video in regards to a previous video that I released back in December, I believe it was December 5th, regarding the exclusive or the official Raspberry Pi 5 case. So there are a lot of questions and concerns about that particular review, and apologize. I know this is now in May, but I've been really busy, if you guys could see, with RetroPie, Maximum Carnage, as well as several other tests that I'm really backed up on. And so had some downtime today to kind of discuss a very important subject matter. And today's video, obviously, we're going to do a follow-up with this and also talk about the Argon case. I know this isn't brand new. This is the Argon what is this called? A Neo case, or the Neo case. I picked this up back in January, actually. So I know it's May. I haven't officially assembled it. So we're going to talk a little bit about overclocking, test case scenarios, and a little bit about some of the overclock bench test marks that you guys have kind of seen on the web, some best practices that should have been followed, because this is going to be a little bit of concern going forward based upon how we measure a lot of the single board computers, not just the Raspberry Pi 5 in particularly, but just to make sure that we're kind of on par as far as where we should be testing, how we should be conducting tests kind of going forward. So we have the official Raspberry Pi 5 test, and I know many of you had commented that I didn't know how to take this off. Yes, I knew this came off, but the idea of when I got this was, obviously there were no cases available at that time, nothing that you could really pick up in the store. In fact, Micro Center is the only one that I know of locally that's a brick and mortar that kind of had all the accessories. And so the idea was to get a case and also protect it and also keep it cool. Now, the idea was for me to use the active cooler in conjunction with the fan based upon a number of tests I had already performed. So for those of you who are new to this channel, I do a lot of RetroPie testing, primarily retro gaming. That's primarily the genre here on the channel in regards to a lot of the single board computers that you guys see here in terms of reviews. But I do a lot of extensive testing. I don't measure my points or benchmarks specifically by any form of a benchmark, because some of those benchmarks don't tell you the secrets in terms of what you really need to know in regards to running many of these. And so here we have this is the active cooler with a open case using my Raspberry Pi 5, and then of course I have another Raspberry Pi 5 here. Now, my personal belief, and I do believe that this should be the practice going forward, is that it's very difficult and nearly impossible to measure what any single board computer can do without actual development. We'll get into that here in just a minute. That's why a lot of times I talk to other members of the Supreme team, and we look at certain boards as far as what are we going to support. And then typically, if you guys notice, a lot of my reviews is always done primarily after some active development. For example, there have been many videos touting that the Raspberry Pi 5 could run PlayStation 2 originally when they came out. And a lot of those tests were made from a desktop environment, not a retro gaming front end, which is typically what you would use in a working class scenario. Well, lo and behold, a couple of months went by, November came around, December came by, and then you found out like, oh, only the Supreme team, which made a unofficial version or released it, it's still RetroPie, but it's the unofficial release of RetroPie for the Raspberry Pi 5, were the only front ends to carry the Ether PlayStation 2 emulator. Batacera had issues with it. It was hiccuping. It couldn't run correctly. And then Recalbox also said that they were not supporting it at all. So what would have been the point in running something from desktop if it's not going to give you a true working environment, a real use case scenario, if you can't even use the program on that particular front end? So case in point, when you guys saw that video back in December, I had already done a lot of extensive testing. I know what my temps were using the Raspberry Pi 5, whether it was overclocked, non-overclocked, and also talked to some of the other devs and image makers in the community that had a concern about temps. Now, These weren't temps initially by everybody measuring some type of benchmark, because a benchmark test, well, here's the thing about benchmarks. It only lasts for like 5 minutes, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 30 seconds, 5 minutes, but it is far from a real use case scenario. So for example, if you're overclocking your Raspberry Pi 5 and you turn it up to 3 gigahertz or whatever, well, I ran that specific test on desktop and it runs fine. You can overclock the GPU up to about what, 900, whatever the case might be, overclock it to about 3 gigahertz. My temps here, I know I haven't posted any of this information, and this isn't my full official review about overclocking and my temps, but the temps on this case, in an open case with the active cooler, is about 28 degrees. Now that is actually the coolest you guys will probably find around in this working environment. Some of the other people, when they first got their Raspberry Pi 5s, they had it open air with a heatsink, and some of those guys left their Raspberry Pi 5s on for 2 or 3 days straight, compiling emulators and so forth. And their average temps were about 68 to about 69 degrees in an open air case, in an open air environment with no case whatsoever. So looking at this particular case, and when I bought it, yes, I knew that this whole thing could come off, but the idea would be to keep it as cool as possible, making sure that you could use the active cooler in conjunction with this kind of fan, which would be the best working case scenario. Now, the other issue that we ran into was, well, how hot would this be? Because if we're already getting 69 degrees over 2 or 3 days of compiling, which is actual work, not a bench test that lasts like 5 seconds, but actual work, well then, what are the temps going to look like if you put it in something like this, where there's no airflow and all you have is this little fan? But really, you either have a choice of a little small heat sink in a fan or just going with the active cooler. So I already knew, based upon the test that I performed, based upon talking to other devs in a real use case environment, what the temps would possibly look like. So again, the object was, because I had used something like this, was to have a fan on top with an active cooler to get the best possible test results in general. So fast forward to now, I know that there's been some software updates or some firmware updates, EEPROM updates or whatnot. But again, just kind of speaking it from a general sense, it's very vital that we have development on a lot of these single board computers prior to making a lot of benchmark results, because they don't tell the full honest truth about what's going on in some of these case scenarios. So for example, most of the benchmarks, and I've ran them myself, even if you overclock, the temps on a Raspberry Pi 5 could get up to about 68, 70 something degrees. Now that's over a 4-minute process, maybe 6 minutes, whatever the case might be. But one of the most demanding applications that you could run on single board computers right now, we'll keep it limited to the Raspberry Pi 5. One of the most demanding things that you can run on it right now is Kodi, which in idle set my temps all the way up to about 48 degrees Celsius. And then PlayStation 2 emulation. Now, when I do my tests, just to kind of give you guys some insights, when I do my tests with RetroPie, retro gaming, and so forth, again, we have to have adequate development. I tested the PS2 emulator overclocked and non-overclocked. And I ran my test, not a 10-minute test, not a 5-minute test, because you could overclock this or RetroPie or some of the other distros or programs that are out there, and it'll run fine for about maybe 5 or 10 minutes. However, in my test, I took it as far as I could, and if you guys have Supreme Ultra for the RetroPie, I set some of those overclocks myself based on a real use case scenario. I overclocked RetroPie to about 3 gigahertz, and then I took the GPU up to about 900 or whatever the case might be, and after 4 minutes, it crashed. So I had to go back in, I had to lower the voltage, I had to lower the overclock on the CPU and the GPU. After 10 minutes, went back in, it crashed on me again. Went back in again, 15 minutes later to about 30 minutes, I started to see some stability issues. It would work for about maybe 30 minutes or so, and then of course the same thing happened. There were some stability issues. Then I did that for an hour. And so what I had to do was slowly adjust my CPU and my GPU overclock as well as my voltage till everything could stay stable. Now, I've ran this, my PlayStation 2 emulation with the Raspberry Pi 5 RetroPie, not for 1 hour, not for 2 hours, but I ran it for up to 8 hours. And this is the point of this video, is that when we're doing our tests, a lot of the overclock tests that you see in not Geekbench, but benchmarks that you receive don't cover a real use scenario case testing. The reason why I do these particular tests is because most of us, when we're using RetroPie, Raspberry Pi 5, you're using it for gaming, you're going to put this in an arcade cabinet. You're going to let that arcade cabinet run for about 12 hours, 8 hours, maybe a couple of days. You always have a lot of YouTubers and streamers and people in general, when they have their game room, they leave it on all day. They don't leave it on for 5 minutes and 30 minutes or whatever. So we have to possibly test for the best real use case scenario. Doing a basic bench test means absolutely nothing if it could possibly crash after about 10 minutes or 5 minutes. And that's typically what you will find on the web. Again, in fact, you guys could look at my other channel, Arcade Media. I did a live stream. I think there's only 2 videos on the live stream format. Arcade Media, you guys go look it up. Ran that test back in December. And I ran Tekken live for about an hour. I took my dog for a walk, came back, went to see what it could do. That was actually part of my test. And I think I left some of the benchmarks there, but I believe I was overclocked that day as well. And so I came back, and then after about, maybe it was 30 minutes, 40 minutes, you guys can go back and look at the video, the sound cut out. The video still worked, but the sound cut out. Again, I was overclocked. So again, what point is overclocking even in that sense if you have stability issues or if the sound fails after several hours? Bench tests aren't going to tell you any of that information. Also, too, if some of those bench tests, if they were ran for a consecutive amount of time, for like over an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and they were in a case like this, it possibly would have reached thermal limits because the temps were rising. In fact, there are several videos where people use something very similar to this. Not this particular case, but something very similar where it was in an enclosed case. And the first test, their temps were about 28, 29 degrees. Then they ran it, they turned it off, turned it back on, and then the temps were about 30 normal, and then they slowly kept the rise. Now, if they kept doing that over several hours, 7, 8 hours or so, the temps would have rose because this thing would have created an oven, so to speak. Not this particular case, but whatever case it was using. So to me, those aren't adequate tests because that is not a real use case scenario. Nobody's going to maximize this for about turn up the overclock to 3 gigahertz or 900 megahertz or whatever gigahertz on the GPU side, overclock, turn up the voltage and use it for 5 minutes. That is totally inadequate. That is not a real use case scenario. And many of us, many customers, many of you watching the channel or any channel are going to make your decision and purchasing decision based upon something ran for 5 minutes, something that's not used to spec, and something that is not a real use case scenario. So in some of my tests, if you guys have RetroPie, you guys seen any of that stuff, I personally tested on my own personal Pi 8 hours at least, 8 to 12 hours, sometimes leave it on a couple of days, and I measure my temps that way to measure and monitor stability, because it's totally useless to use something for 3 gigahertz, 5 gigahertz, 5, whatever, and the damn thing doesn't even, maybe it won't stay stable, or it crashes on you after 5 minutes or 30 seconds and so forth, or maybe up to an hour. That's what you have to test for. And so again, the biggest purpose in having some of these single board computers and even running tests is longevity, real use case scenarios. My cousin, he runs a Raspberry Pi farm where they monitor a bunch of electronic equipment and so forth. That's a real case use, not 5 minutes, maximizing it to 2.9 gigahertz, 2.8. I think that was my soft spot, somewhere around there was about 2.8. 2.9 gigahertz. I had to kind of measure the GPU and the CPU to make sure that I was able to run as high as possible and also stay stable as much as possible. And again, I can't stress this enough. The Ether emulator, PlayStation 2 emulation, is one of the most demanding things that you can run, not just on the Raspberry Pi 5, but also Orange Pi. My Orange Pi, my temps on that, I think it got up to about 55, almost 60 degrees. You don't overclock that, but running PlayStation 2 emulation for several hours, not a couple of minutes, not 5 minutes, not 10 minutes, well, over several hours. I'm talking about 6 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours. What does it look like then? So many of those cases, many of the tests, the temps in the official Raspberry Pi case would have rose. It would have been even higher than it was if it had maintained like this, because there's no additional airflow. And again, running a bench test by itself with no particular load on it for any point of time is it really going to give you a true benchmark because it's not a real use case scenario. Now, I do have this Argon Neo case. I will be doing several tests on this. Not only will I do an overclock test just to see how the temps differ from a stock Raspberry Pi 5 in my open air case, which gives me 28 degrees Celsius. And then when I overclocked it, it pushed me only up to about 33 degrees. Again, 33 degrees, 28 normal, 33 degrees overclocked, no throttling issues, nothing of that nature. So we'll see if this is one of the best solutions. Now, before I even get into this test, not in this video, but in a future video, I already know working with open air and having a cool fan going 100% this silent too is really going to give me the best possible results, other than me when I get ready to dump it in some ice cubes, my waterproof Raspberry Pi 5, when I dump that into some ice tests. That'll probably be one of the coolest tests you guys have seen around. But again, the importance is when we're looking at these bench tests, we really need to use a real working scenario based upon the available tools. That's why development before reviews is vital, because imagine me, I know Adobe After Effects and Adobe Premiere, that's not something that's going to work on the Raspberry Pi 5. But let's just say, for the example, if you're planning to use a single board computer for video editing, that company that's producing that software for video editing or AI, whatever the case might be, you have to wait for them to fully port something over first and adequately to do any type of performance bench test to see what it can truly do in a real use case scenario. Because if you don't have development, your results are going to be skewed. Many of you probably didn't know that until I just told you that Supreme Ultra, when I was using it and I overclocked it to certain limits, it crashed on me after 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes. And again, I had to slowly adjust those numbers until it became stable, not for 1 hour, not for 2 hours, but I had to make sure I could overclock it as far as I could and make sure that my image, the build, stays stable for many hours to come. That will tell you more about the board, what it could do, whether it's an EEPROM update. And again, that a lot of this has something to do with the board, but also the EEPROM updates and whatever. Again, I have not EEPROM update this since December or whatever, but I'm just letting you know what type of methods you need to follow when doing a video review and also measuring true performance results of what something can truly do. So again, I tested that over a course of several hours, but you need to be aware of waiting on the importance of development before we really just measure the performance or what a board can and cannot do without any of those measurable results. And that's why I also mentioned PlayStation 2 emulation earlier, because not every image, not every build can run that, because again, we still could run into an issue where it could compile. So imagine making your reviews or basing your results on a standard bench test, and you don't know if the software you're planning on running with it is going to stay stable over any point in time. We could overclock many single board computers up to 2.5, 2.8, or even 3 gigahertz, but if it doesn't stay stable within your real use case scenario environment, then what's the point? That's why Intel chips are really popular right now. That's why many of you have switched over to x86, is because with those x86 chips, they may come in at 2.5 gigahertz, but it has a boost limit to 3.7, 3.8, 3.9 gigahertz. And then when it doesn't need that power, then drops back down to 2.5. Unfortunately, with the Raspberry Pi 5 and many of the other single board computers, once you overclock, it's using that power regardless. It's up to 3 gigahertz, whatever, even if it's just sitting there. Now, I know the workload is a little bit lower, but it doesn't have that ability to give you that burst limit, go up, go down. Like, let's say the, the RK3588, which is an octa-core processor. You have 4 chips on the 876 side and then 4 chips on the 855. And then that's running different tasks in the background. And then it's, I don't know, it's really hard to explain. It's using big little technology, and you can see all the processes going on in the background. But again, that's a chip that doesn't require overclocking. It's managing its resources directly in the background. So again, just wanted to make this video for all of you and my concerns to how some of these bench tests should be marked. It should be based on not just a standard bench test, which only lasts for like 5 seconds. And again, for those of you who are into weightlifting, you know, probably many of you, maybe like me, I could bench press 300 pounds, but you asked me to do that 30 times or leave it up for an hour, 8 hours. Heck no, that's not going to happen. So in regards to some of the bench tests and remarks and even overclocking, it's not just important to measure the test result based upon a 4-minute test. It's also about durability, longevity, and the real use case scenario. Because even within those circumstances, you have to make sure, even if you're overclocking or using a particular case, what does it look like after several hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, a week? Well, not even so much a week, but you will get better numbers or a better result or better idea about what can run with particular cases, and measure those numbers over a longer period of time of 8 to 12 hours, and not something that's going to be measured within 5 minutes, 4 minutes, or whatever the case might be. So with that being said, I hope you guys consider liking and subscribing. I'm going to get out here and prep up for my fireworks shoot. Make sure you guys check out kiodiekin and also kiodiekin if you guys are into RC cars. I do a lot of things here on the channel, so I will have some other interesting reviews and tutorials to get you guys up and running, and I will catch you guys later. Peace out. Have a great day. Bye-bye.